A report looking into foreign interference in the 2021 federal election has just been released. An independent panel says it, quote, did not detect foreign interference that threatened Canada's ability to have a free and fair election. But that doesn't mean the threat doesn't exist. Let's bring in Intergovernmental Affairs Minister Dominic LeBlanc. Minister LeBlanc, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, good evening, David.
I will confess, we've just gotten this report in the last half hour, so I haven't read absolutely everything. But on that headline that there was foreign interference, but not enough to jeopardize the overall integrity of the election, what's your response to that?
That's something, David, that we've been saying for some time. The idea that foreign countries, and particularly China, but not exclusively China, other authoritarian regimes would seek to interfere with democratic institutions in Canada is not new, and it's not only at the federal level, by the way. Our government has taken this very seriously from the very beginning. We put in place a series of measures that were reviewed in Mr. Rosenberg's report today. None of those measures existed in the previous Conservative government. So we've always acknowledged, recognized the threat, and we think we've put in place a series of rigorous, independent, senior public servants during the election period, who are in the best position to evaluate these threats and mitigate them and take whatever corrective measures we can from election to election to adjust our posture and ensure that, in fact, these threats don't undermine the result of the election. That's what was confirmed today. But Mr. Rosenberg has made some thoughtful recommendations, obviously, which we'll look forward to discussing with the panel. And we hope strengthen, again, a process that we believe is quite rigorous.
I want to go through a couple of things, the findings and some of the recommendations, if I can. And on page 10 of the report, for those of you reading along at home, Mr. Rosenberg does outline attempts at foreign interference by China aim at the Conservative Party of Canada directly through a Global Times editorial, saying that they have a campaign platform that almost wants to break diplomatic relationship with China, asking the question, is the U.S. about to get another loyal dog? And then he goes specific on Kenny Chiu, who is a Conservative candidate, who has made the point that he feels he lost his seat because of Chinese interference. And he points out that Today Commercial News, a Chinese-Canadian newspaper that publishes the People's Daily Overseas edition, posted a WeChat story that claims that Kenny Wu's legislation would require all individuals or groups with ties to China to register as agents of the Chinese government. And the story urges people to spread the word about his bill that would suppress the Chinese community. These are things we're finding out 18 months after the election that the committee had knowledge of. Shouldn't people have been warned of this in real time when it was happening?
But again, that's a decision, David, that is made by this independent panel of very senior public servants, chaired by the clerk of the Privy Council. During an election, it shouldn't be up to a partisan government to make those decisions. That's why we thought we should have this very mechanism in place with that Mr. Rosenberg reviewed. In this particular case, this kind of disinformation is an exact example of the kind of foreign interference that's not new in Canadian democracy, but in the view of these independent public servants, people like the Deputy Attorney General of Canada, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Clerk of the Privy Council, the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister. These people concluded that that interference did not change the outcome of the election. We think that's what's significant, but we shouldn't be naive, and we haven't been naive, David, about the threat that some of this interference represents to Canadian democracy. And that's why we put in place these measures. And we'll look at Mr. Rosenberg's recommendations with a view to strengthening the measures for the next election. This is exactly as we did, by the way, after the 2019 election, when we also had an independent review of the mechanism.
He also, though, Mr. Rosenberg talks about this lack of public notification, and he makes a recommendation on reviewing what the threshold is for public notification. And he makes the point on page 35, the context around the origins of the protocol, that's the protocol for notification, leads to the conclusion that the threshold is being interpreted as requiring an incident or incidents that threatens the integrity of the entire election, not just one riding or a handful of ridings. And he goes on to make the point that if there was a clear case of interference that affected a single riding or targeted an ethnic group, which seems very appropriate considering the context of this week, it's unlikely to be considered significant enough to threaten the credibility of the entire election. And yet, if there is no mechanism to inform the voters targeted, they may exercise their votes based on false information or be intimidated into not voting at all. That seems like a significant gap in the oversight rules that we have, as pointed out by Mr. Rosenberg, that if we're only alerting about things that can change the whole election, we're not alerting about these smaller levels of interference that could affect 1, 2, 3, or 4, 5 ridings. What's your government prepared to do about that, sir?
Well, we're obviously prepared to implement the recommendations that Mr. Rosenberg advanced. He, in that particular section, and you're right, you quoted it obviously correctly, he talks about the impact as being a word that perhaps would lead the panel, the independent panel, to conclude that it's sort of the general election itself, the outcome of the national election itself. We will obviously want to review those recommendations. I've had a number of conversations with officials and with Mr. Rosenberg himself. When he gave us the report, he went through the recommendations with me personally. And my instruction to the Privy Council officials is to see how we can implement those recommendations. So I think what's significant, David, for us is that we acknowledge the threat. We have taken action that previous governments haven't to ensure that Canadians are aware of the threat. It's more than just a protocol reporting publicly during an election campaign. We've put a number of other initiatives in place, for example, around citizen resilience, helping NGOs and other academic institutions build up better citizen awareness around disinformation, around reliable information. So it's a complex undertaking that we're prepared to continue in a very aggressive and thorough way. We believe the measures we have in place have ensured the integrity of the 2019 and 2021 elections, but we certainly accept Mr. Rosenberg's suggestions of how to strengthen them.
I wonder, though, Minister, the reassurances from the Prime Minister on down has been that the results of the election, we can have faith in the integrity of the overall results. But given the points that Mr. Rosenberg has made here about individual candidates being targeted, specific parties being targeted, and the low threshold of public notification based on number of ridings and possible individual ethnic groups being targeted, can we say that all 338 results, that those results have integrity based on this? It seems to me that we can't necessarily make that conclusion.
I don't share that view, David. I think all 338 constituencies elected freely and fairly their representatives in the last election. So we have no reason to think that whatever foreign interference or other interference took place changed the outcome in an individual riding. The panel had in its authority the ability to publicly discuss during the context of a writ period any of these particular incidents. They decided not to. I think we have to be very careful. We're confident that all 338 constituencies in Canada on election night in 2019 and again in 2021 freely elected the people that sit with me in Canada's House of Commons. But we do take Mr. Rosenberg's comments around the impact of a particular act of interference. We take those comments seriously, and we'll be looking with the appropriate officials in the Privy Council office how we can put those recommendations into place.
The oversight exists only in the writ period right now, and one of the recommendations here is to extend it to in particular to the pre-writ period, because by the time the campaigning begins and the government goes into caretaker mode, it may be too late to start targeting the disinformation campaign. That seems like an obvious change. Is that something you're prepared to do, Minister?
Of course it is, and that was in my conversation with Mr. Rosenberg. As I said, when he went through with me the individual recommendations, that makes eminent sense. There's obviously an issue about ministers being responsible for their particular portfolios outside of a writ period, where, as you noted, the caretaker convention has existed for decades in Westminster parliamentary democracies. But we do think that there is significant merit in ensuring that the panel or another appropriate group of independent senior public servants are in place in a pre-writ period, as you said, to ensure, for example, that nomination campaigns which are governed by a series of internal party rules, are also free from foreign interference. All of this, David, is something that we've taken seriously. We think it should be a nonpartisan issue in the sense that every recognized political party had access to the panel, had access to sensitive intelligence information. They were security cleared and were able to participate in the intelligence information that Canada's intelligence agencies gathered during the election period. So we think it has to be a transparent process amongst political parties, because everybody should want to, and I believe does want to, ensure the integrity of democratic institutions. It's not simply our party that worries about that. All parliamentarians and all political parties do. So we need to work with them, as we have, to ensure that they're able to participate in the appropriate way and get the reassurance that we've gotten from Canada's security experts that in fact the result of the election was not compromised.
Minister, how do you reconcile these findings and your reassurances with the reporting we've seen from the Globe and Mail and from Global News and others over the last couple of weeks about the level of activity attributed to the Chinese government and the Chinese state in its attempts to meddle, interfere, influence, whatever verb you want to use, in our elections? How do you reconcile the clean bill of health for the 2021 election with these numerous reports of activity?
Well, the clean bill of health, David, is your term. What we've said is, of course, there have been attempts at foreign interference. We haven't said there have not been. We're the only government, by the way, that put into place these rigorous measures to deal with it, to mitigate these foreign interference attempts. And if a certain threshold is met in the view of independent public service experts, to tell Canadians. So we think that the 2021 election was free and fair, and the results were determined by Canadians who went to vote. We continue to believe that, and Mr. Rosenberg does not dispute that. What we also have noted, and Mr. Rosenberg highlights it, is China, amongst other countries, are increasingly, CSIS has said so publicly as well, David, are increasingly attempting to interfere, some cases in diaspora communities in Canada. So we need to be ready to put all of the safeguards in place to reassure Canadians. That's what we've done, but we'll continue to look at ways we can improve it. And Mr. Rosenberg's report today is a very important step in that direction.
An important bit of distinction I'm hoping to make here. Mr. Rosenberg wrote this report and he's made the recommendations, but the conclusions on the integrity of the election are of the committee, correct? Or is this Mr. Rosenberg drawing this conclusion?
No, you're correct. It's the panel set up under the cabinet directive, the protocol we put in place. But Mr. Rosenberg had extensive discussions with panel members from the 2021 election, panel members from the 2019 election. He spoke to other outside experts. He also spoke to different political parties. So the work that he did last fall was extensive, and he had access to all of the sensitive intelligence information that the panel of senior independent public servants would have had as well.
Okay, because I asked that because you've seen the criticism from the Conservatives that the integrity of this report has been undermined because Mr. Rosenberg, a career public servant who served for cabinet ministers in the Conservative government, such as John Barrett and Lawrence Cannon, was also the chief executive officer of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation. And they argue that the findings of this report are tainted and undermined because of that. What's your reaction to that, sir?
Well, that's a typical Conservative smear, David. Mr. Rosenberg was a senior deputy minister in the government of Canada for 3 different governments. Mr. Harper made him the deputy minister of foreign affairs, one of the most senior public service positions in Canada. He went to work at an academic institution that has also seen people like David Johnston or Bill Davis or Peter Lougheed affiliated with it as well. So I think it's a gratuitous smear that the Conservatives like to do. I think Mr. Rosenberg's career and reputation and experience stands very much on its own merits. And we're very happy to have accepted the recommendation to retain him to do this review.
You don't think it was a mistake to pick someone with connections to the Trudeau Foundation? You could have picked I realize he was picked last year. It was before these latest allegations and reports came out. But might it not have been better to find someone with no connections with, for example, the Trudeau Foundation to do this work in hindsight?
David, we're very confident that he was the right person to do this work. And as I said, that somebody tries to smear somebody that Mr. Harper made Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs isn't very serious. We think that he's done an excellent job. And the recommendation to retain Mr. Rosenberg to do this work came from the Privy Council office. It didn't come from some partisan actor whatsoever.
Okay, I have one last question for you. This report makes it very clear that the issue of foreign interference is broader than China, but it does single out China notably for the level and extent of the interference in 2021, which aligns with a lot of the public reporting we've seen. Why have you not taken any action against consular officials in China, from the ambassador on down, some of whom it's shown up, it's been reported, are in CSIS documents bragging about their interference in Canadian elections? How are those people allowed to continue to function as diplomats in Canada, given what we know about the level of foreign interference?
Well, that's a very good question, David. Obviously, the Department of Foreign Affairs, Global Affairs Canada, reviews this intelligence information on an ongoing basis. The Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs is somebody who sits on the panel during the election, reviews this information, has access to all of the intelligence information as well. We'll take whatever responsibility or whatever action is appropriate to safeguard and to ensure that we continue to safeguard democratic institutions. But the Department of Foreign Affairs is certainly not idly standing by when these kind of interferences are detected. I have every confidence that they'll hold those responsible for this kind of activity to account.
Okay, Minister LeBlanc, thank you very much for joining us. I may have more questions once I get to read the whole report. Hopefully you can come back. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Well, maybe you'll invite me back later this week. Thanks very much, David. Have a great evening.
We'll hold you to it. All right, that's Intergovernmental Affairs Minister Dominic LeBlanc. All right, my next guest can also speak to the Chinese government's interest in the Liberal Party. That's Guy Saint-Jacques. He served as Canada's ambassador to China from 2012 to 2016. Mr. Saint-Jacques, thank you so much for waiting while I spoke to Minister LeBlanc. What did you make of what you just heard there from the minister about the government's response to Chinese interference in the last election?
Well, I think it's a useful step, but it's not enough because, in fact, we have learned a lot more about what China has been trying to do to interfere in the election, and we have to put that in context. This is part of a larger systematic approach about the Chinese government to try to influence public opinion, to interfere on academic campuses among the Chinese diaspora, and in fact, I find that there are parts in the report that don't cover what we have learned in recent articles of the Globe and Mail and of Global. For instance, the use of social media, WeChat, to spread disinformation. And there were systematic efforts when the minister and the prime minister has said this, that it's Canadians that went to vote. Of course, it's Canadians that went to vote. But the fact is that we have to look at what took place before they went to vote. It's like a hockey game. The hockey game is won on the ice. But if one team comes on the ice and has not been able to get its skates sharpened, of course, it will have an impact. And so from my perspective, knowing everything that China is doing and trying to do, we are at the stage that we have to be reassured about the integrity of our electoral system. And for this, I would say someone like Justice Arbour should be called to make a full report and come up with a recommendation, because yes, there have been things that have been done, but I find that the government has been very slow to react. It would have been easy to call in the Chinese ambassador and without revealing all the sources of the information to just outline that we were aware of what was going on, and if this did not stop, that we would expel Chinese diplomats. And so for me, there's still a cloud on the integrity of the election. I think that, I have a lot of respect for Maurice Rosenberg. He has been a great public official, but again, we are at the stage where we have learned more recently. Canadians have lots of questions, and we need to get to the bottom of this.
You got a lot in there. I just want to pick up on where I ended with Minister LeBlanc, the fact that not a single consular official, nobody, as far as we know, has been kicked out of the country and stripped of their diplomatic privileges because of this. Why do you think that is? Because, you know, elections are absolutely central to any democracy, and if they're meddling like this and it's escalating and threatens to be worse in the future, what do you make of the lack of consequence?
Well, also what surprises me is that, in fact, we have known for quite some time that there was interference by the Chinese in our political system. You know, I was ambassador until 2016. I was aware of some cases where officials from the Chinese consulate in Toronto, for instance, intervened to stop a visit to Taiwan by a member of parliament. You know, there were a number of things, but what we have learned, what they did in the 2019 election, but more importantly in the 2021 election, represent a step further. You know, I'm surprised that there has not been any pushback. There's a lot more that could have been done. And for now, also, when we look at, you know, the fact that some businessmen were encouraged to pay Chinese students to go to work as volunteers for some candidates. Well, this should be investigated. There are a number of things that could be done. And in the end, I would say also that we have to look at what Australia did. Australia was faced with a similar problem about 5 years ago. They adopted 4 laws to prevent Chinese interference. You know, I don't understand why we have not been more proactive to try to prevent more such interference.
You were ambassador until 2016, and there's reports today in the Globe that it was in the years leading up to that China started to take an interest in Justin Trudeau when he became leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, tried to facilitate cash donations to the Trudeau Foundation. This is what has been reported. What did you see in China? Why this shift, and is this real? Was there a shift in attitudes in Beijing favoring Justin Trudeau and the Liberals over the Conservatives when he became leader?
Well, you know, I was told, quite frankly, from Chinese officials that, especially after the election in 2015, that they were quite pleased that Mr. Trudeau was elected. And they summarized this by saying, red is good and blue is bad. And I said, you know, you are kidding yourself, because go back in history, when Brian Mulroney was Prime Minister, he was very active in China. He was the one who doubled the Canadian development assistance to China. And you can expect that Mr. Trudeau will raise tough questions on human rights in China. But clearly they had lots of expectations that the relationship would improve and would get better over time. And what I saw when Mr. Trudeau came to power, obviously he wanted to improve relations with China, but I must confess that his knowledge of China was outdated, despite all the reports that were sent by the embassy to explain how Xi Jinping was changing China, how much repression was taking place in the country, how much religious freedom of expression were disappearing. But also, more importantly, he had increased very substantially the budgets of the United Front Work Department to try to move public opinion outside of China to be more favorable to China. And when you put all this together, you have to see China as an adversary. But I'm glad that this was finally recognized in the Indo-Pacific strategy, where China is named as a disruptive power.
Do you think China still views it that way, given the changing attitudes of this government towards China? Just as a final point, I mean, they wanted to deepen trade ties, then the Michaels have happened, and now this has happened. And as you point out, the Indo-Pacific strategy. Where do you think China feels its interests lie right now?
Well, you know, I would have used other words than just disruptive power. I think this is very polite. China is a bully. We have seen this with the two Michaels, you know, taking people hostage, using trade as a weapon. Clearly, China is acting as a bully, and we have to push back. We have to work with allies to develop common positions. Otherwise, this is the only language that China understands, firmness. And if you are not firm, they will push and push, and you lose your freedom gradually.
Okay, Guy Saint-Jacques, thank you for your time tonight and your patience in waiting for me to talk to Minister LeBlanc. Thank you so much. That's former Canadian Ambassador to China, Guy Saint-Jacques.
Thank you.